They laughed when the empath got quiet, not because they understood the silence, but because they thought the silence meant weakness. That's the biggest mistake people make about empaths. They think kindness means dependence. They think patience means permission. They think forgiveness means unlimited access. But there comes a moment, a dangerous moment, when the empath stops explaining, stops chasing, stops trying to save everyone. And when that moment arrives, the entire energy shifts, because the empath who chooses peace over people becomes unstoppable. Most people have never seen a healed empath. They've only seen the exhausted version, the overgiving version, the emotionally available version, the version that answered every late-night call, carried everyone's pain, and abandoned themselves trying to keep others comfortable. People fear the empath's silence more than their anger, because anger is emotional, silence is final. Most people never notice the moment an empath begins changing. It doesn't happen loudly. There's no dramatic speech, no warning, no revenge. It begins with exhaustion. The kind of exhaustion sleep cannot fix. The kind that comes from giving your heart to people who only loved your usefulness. The empath keeps showing up, keeps forgiving, keeps understanding, keeps carrying emotional weight nobody sees, smiling while silently breaking inside. And the terrifying part is, nobody notices the damage while the empath is still giving. People only notice the empath when the giving stops. That's when panic begins. Because the person who answered every call suddenly becomes distant. The person who absorbed everyone's pain suddenly protects their energy. The person who once over-explained every emotion now says nothing at all. And people mistake this silence for weakness. But they don't understand something dangerous. The empath's silence is not emotional collapse. It is emotional transformation. There comes a point where the empath realizes we have spent their entire life teaching people how to treat them, by tolerating disrespect, by accepting half-love, by staying silent about their own pain just to keep others comfortable. And eventually, their soul gets tired of bleeding for people who would never even scratch themselves for them. That realization changes everything, because once an empath sees the truth, they can never unsee it again. They begin remembering every moment they ignored their intuition, every fake apology, every one-sided friendship, every time someone disappeared until they needed emotional support again. And suddenly, the empath understands something heartbreaking. They were loved for their availability, not their value. That realization cuts deeply, because empaths love fully, purely, without calculation. They give people emotional safety, patience, presence, understanding, things this world rarely offers anymore. But toxic people don't see empathy as a gift. They see it as access. Unlimited access. Access to your time, your energy, your forgiveness, your softness. And the empath keeps giving, thinking love will eventually be returned equally. But emotionally intelligent people learn a painful truth. Some people will drain oceans from you and still complain you gave them rain. That's why the empath slowly changes. Not because they hate people, because they finally see people clearly, and clarity changes behavior. The empath begins noticing how certain people only appear during loneliness, only call during crisis, only care when they need healing, but disappear the moment the empath needs support. That imbalance becomes impossible to ignore. And this is where the silence begins. The empath stops arguing, stops defending themselves, stops begging to be understood by people committed to misunderstanding them. That silence shocks people, because people were comfortable with the old empath, the version that kept forgiving everything, the version that tolerated emotional inconsistency, the version that kept giving chances long after respect disappeared. But this new silence feels different, heavy, unreachable, certain. Because for the first time, the empath is no longer trying to save the connection. They are trying to save themselves, and that changes their entire energy. You can feel it. The empath no longer chases conversations that feel forced, no longer over-explains their pain to emotionally unavailable people, no longer fights to keep relationships that only survive through their effort, and suddenly people say, "You changed," but what they really mean is, "You stopped sacrificing yourself for me." That's what scares people. The empath was never weak, just unguarded. There's a difference. Weak people seek validation. Empaths seek connection. And because they seek genuine connection, they often ignore red flags, hoping love can heal what honesty already exposed. But eventually reality becomes louder than hope. The empath starts realizing that loyalty without reciprocity is self-destruction. That being understanding all the time teaches people to take advantage of your understanding. That constantly forgiving disrespect does not make you mature. It makes you emotionally exhausted. And once an empath reaches emotional exhaustion, something dangerous happens. They detach. Not emotionally explosive, emotionally unavailable. That's the moment people lose access to them forever. Because empaths don't leave quickly. They leave mentally first. Quietly. Observing, quietly hurting, quietly realizing they deserve better. And by the time they physically walk away, their heart already left weeks ago. That's why their silence feels cold. But it's not coldness. It's self-protection. The empath finally realizes that not everyone deserves explanations. Not everyone deserves another chance. Not everyone deserves access to their vulnerability. And when they learn this lesson, their energy becomes impossible to manipulate. Because manipulators survive through emotional reactions, but the healed empath stops reacting emotionally to everything. They observe patterns instead of excuses, and silence becomes their power. Not loudness, not revenge, silence. The kind of silence that says, "I finally see who you are." That silence terrifies people, because people were expecting emotional arguments, begging, crying, another attempt to fix things. But instead they receive distance. And distance is powerful, because distance exposes everything. We exposes who truly cared, who only cared about convenience, who respected your heart, and who simply enjoyed controlling your emotions. The empath starts becoming more selective, more private, more protective of their peace, not because they became heartless, because they finally understand their energy is valuable. See, empaths spend years believing their purpose is to heal everyone around them. But one day they wake up and realize they were destroying themselves trying to rescue people who were comfortable staying broken. That realization creates emotional maturity. Now the empath moves differently. They stop forcing conversations, stop forcing love, stop forcing loyalty, because emotionally intelligent people understand something powerful. Anything forced is already broken. So instead of chasing closure, the empath chooses peace. Instead of seeking validation, they choose self-respect. Instead of fighting for toxic connections, they quietly let go. And people cannot understand this version of the empath, because this version no longer fears losing people. They fear losing themselves. That is the transformation. That is the awakening. The empath who once cried for acceptance now walks away from disrespect in silence. The empath who once overgave emotionally now protects their peace like survival depends on it. The empath who once tolerated emotional chaos now disappears the moment their spirit feels disturbed. And the most shocking part? They don't even feel guilty anymore, because guilt disappears when self-respect finally arrives. The empath finally understands that protecting your peace is not selfish. It is survival. And once an empath learns to survive without constant validation, they become emotionally untouchable. Not because they stopped feeling, because they stopped allowing everyone. Nobody teaches empaths emotional intelligence. Pain does. Betrayal does. Disappointment does. The empath becomes emotionally intelligent the same way diamonds are. Created under pressure. At first, the empath believes people mean what they say. They trust words, trust promises, trust energy. Because their heart is genuine, they assume everyone else's heart is too. That innocence becomes their first wound. Because the world quickly teaches them that many people know how to imitate love without ever truly feeling it. And empaths suffer deeply from this realization. Not because they are weak, because they feel everything intensely. Every shift in energy. Every delayed reply. Every fake smile. Every hidden resentment. Empaths notice things most people miss. The problem is, they often ignore what they notice, because they want to believe in people, even when the evidence hurts. So they stay. Stay in one-sided friendships. Stay in draining relationships. Stay loyal to people who secretly enjoy their emotional availability. And every time they ignore their intuition, their soul pays the price. That's how emotional intelligence begins. Not through motivation, through survival. The empath starts noticing patterns. Patterns never lie. Words lie. Faces lie. Intentions hide, but patterns repeat. And emotionally intelligent empaths learn to watch patterns more than promises. They notice who only calls when lonely, who disappears when life gets better, who drains conversations with negativity but never asks how the empath feels. That awareness changes them slowly, because one painful truth becomes impossible to ignore. Not everyone loves you. Some people love access to you, access to your comfort, your reassurance, your emotional labor, and the empath finally realizes they have spent years being emotionally consumed by people who never planned to pour back into them. That realization is devastating, because empaths don't love halfway. When they care completely. They listen deeply, forgive deeply, sacrifice deeply. And toxic people are addicted to that kind of love. Because genuine empathy is rare, but emotionally. Intelligent empaths eventually understand that being needed is not the same as being valued. Read that slowly in your mind. Being needed is not the same as being valued. Some people only keep empaths close because empaths make their life emotionally easier. The empath comforts them, encourages them, heals them, supports them, while silently neglecting themselves. And the dangerous part? Empaths often confuse emotional exhaustion with love. They think suffering for people proves loyalty, but suffering is not love. Self-abandonment is not love. Constant emotional anxiety is not love. And eventually, the empath's nervous system becomes overwhelmed. That's when emotional intelligence deepens. The empath begins understanding that peace is more important than attachment. That calmness matters more than chemistry. That consistency matters more than intensity. Because emotionally immature people create emotional highs and lows. They confuse chaos with passion. But emotionally intelligent people understand something powerful. Real love feels safe, not confusing, not unstable, not emotionally exhausting, safe. And once an empath experiences emotional safety, they stop romanticizing emotional chaos. That's when their standards rise. Now they notice manipulation immediately, the guilt trips, the emotional inconsistency, the fake apologies, the subtle disrespect disguised as jokes. Things they once tolerated now instantly disturb their spirit. Because emotional intelligence sharpens with intuition. The empath no longer ignores red flags just because someone has potential. They finally understand potential means nothing without action. That lesson changes relationships forever. Now the empath watches behavior carefully, not what people say, what people repeatedly do. Because emotionally intelligent people know consistency reveals character. Anybody can pretend temporarily. Anybody can say beautiful things, but patterns always expose intentions. And once an empath learns to trust patterns, they become harder to manipulate. That terrifies toxic people, because manipulators survive through confusion. They want the empath overthinking, questioning themselves, feeling guilty for having boundaries. But emotional intelligence destroys manipulation. The empath starts asking dangerous questions. Why do I feel drained after talking to this person? Why do I constantly feel anxious around them? Why am I always the one fixing everything emotionally? And those questions awaken something powerful, self-awareness. Now the empath notices how certain people only bring chaos into their life, how some relationships feel emotionally heavy every single day, how some people only appear when they need healing but disappear when the empath needs support. That awareness creates emotional distance, not because the empath stopped caring, because they finally started caring about themselves too. That is emotional intelligence. The ability to recognize when your kindness is becoming self-destruction. Most people think emotionally intelligent people have no emotions. Wrong. They feel deeply. They just stop allowing emotions to control their decisions. That's growth. The empath no longer excuses repeated disrespect just because someone had a difficult past. No longer tolerates emotional inconsistency just because someone says I'm trying. Because emotionally intelligent people understand. Trauma explains behavior. It does not excuse harmful behavior. That realization saves. the empath's life emotionally, because for years they carried broken people thinking love could heal everyone. But healing only happens when people choose accountability. And many people don't want healing. They want comfort without change. The empath eventually sees this clearly. And once they do, their entire energy changes. Now they stop trying to rescue everyone. Stop emotionally babysitting adults. Stop draining themselves to maintain connections that only survive through their effort. And people hate this version of the empath because emotionally intelligent empaths become unavailable to emotional manipulation. They stop reacting instantly. Stop over-explaining. Stop begging for understanding. Instead, they observe silently. That silence becomes powerful because observation reveals truth quickly. The empath notices who respects boundaries, who becomes angry when boundaries appear, who only liked them when they were easy to control. And suddenly relationships look different, painfully different. The empath realizes many people were loyal to the access, not loyal to the person. That truth hurts deeply, but it also creates freedom, because emotionally intelligent people stop forcing connections. They understand every relationship is not meant to last forever. Some people are lessons disguised as love. Some people enter your life only to teach you boundaries, only to teach you self-respect, only to teach you what happens when you ignore your intuition repeatedly. And we empaths learn these lessons the hard way, through heartbreak, disappointment, emotional burnout. But those painful experiences create wisdom most people never develop. Now the empath values peace differently, values solitude differently, values energy differently. They become selective with conversations, selective with relationships, selective with who gets access to their vulnerability. Not everyone deserves that access anymore, and that's not bitterness. That's intelligence. Emotional. Intelligence teaches the empath that protecting your mental peace is not selfish. It is necessary. Because constantly absorbing toxic energy destroys the soul slowly. The empath finally understands they cannot heal in environments that continuously hurt them. So they leave, quietly. Not because they stopped loving people, because they finally started loving themselves enough to walk away from what drains them. And the most powerful transformation happens here. The empath no longer fears losing. People, they fear losing their peace. That changes everything. Because once peace becomes priority, manipulation loses power. Chaos loses attraction. Fake love loses appeal. And emotionally intelligent empaths become impossible to emotionally control. Not because they became cold, because they finally learned that protecting their heart is just as important as sharing it. The most dangerous thing an empath can do is finally choose peace over attachment. Because once peace becomes a priority, everything changes. The conversations change, the relationships change, the energy changes. Even the empath's eyes change. There's a calmness there now. Not because life stopped hurting them, because they stopped allowing chaos to live inside them. And most people will never understand this transformation, because society teaches people to chase attention instead of peace, to chase validation instead of healing, to stay connected at all costs, even if the connection destroys their spirit. But the empath eventually reaches a breaking point, a moment where their soul whispers, "I cannot keep surviving like this." That whisper becomes awakening. Because the empath starts realizing how much of their life was spent abandoning themselves just to avoid losing people. They tolerated disrespect to keep relationships alive, silenced their emotions to avoid conflict, overextended their kindness to earn love that should have been natural, and slowly, that emotional self-betrayal destroyed them. From the inside, the empath smiled while drowning emotionally, comforted others while secretly collapsing, stayed available for people who disappeared whenever the empath needed support. And one day their nervous system simply says, enough. That's when peace becomes survival. Not luxury, not selfishness. Survival. The empath begins noticing how emotionally expensive certain people are. How one conversation can ruin their entire day. How fake energy creates anxiety. How emotional inconsistency creates exhaustion, and suddenly they no longer crave intensity. They crave calmness. That's emotional maturity. Immature people think excitement is love. Emotionally intelligent people know peace is love. Because real love does not destroy your sleep. Real love does not make you question your worth daily. Real love does not force you to beg for consistency. And once the empath experiences genuine peace, they become addicted to protecting it. That's when boundaries appear. Real boundaries. Not temporary ones, permanent ones. The empath starts saying no without guilt, starts leaving conversations that drain their energy, starts distancing themselves from people who only bring confusion and emotional heaviness. And toxic people hate boundaries, because boundaries expose intentions immediately. People who respected the empath will understand the boundary. People who benefited from the empath's lack of boundaries will become angry. That anger reveals everything, because emotionally, we, intelligent empaths, finally understand. Anyone upset by your boundaries was benefiting from your self-neglect. That realization is powerful. The empath stops apologizing for protecting their peace, stops feeling guilty for needing space, stops explaining their emotional limits to people determined not to understand them. And that's when inner power begins growing quietly. Not loud power, not ego, silent power, the kind of power that comes from finally respecting yourself emotionally. The empath no longer chases closure, no longer forces understanding, no longer begs people to see their worth, because emotionally intelligent people understand. If someone continuously misunderstands you, they are choosing misunderstanding. And peace means you stop trying to convince people to value what they were committed to losing. That lesson changes the empath forever. Now they move differently, more privately, more intentionally. They stop oversharing their heart with emotionally careless people, because they finally realize their softness is sacred. Not everyone deserves access to it. And this is where the empath becomes dangerous to manipulators, because manipulators need emotional reactions. They survive through chaos, confusion, emotional guilt, but the healed empath no longer reacts impulsively. They pause, observe, and detach if necessary. That emotional discipline terrifies people, because the empath who once tolerated everything now walks away in silence. No arguments, number, revenge, no dramatic exits, just absence. And absence speaks loudly. People suddenly realize how much emotional peace the empath brought into their lives, but by then, the empath is already gone emotionally, because inner peace changes standards permanently. Now the empath values energy more than appearances, consistency more than words, calmness more than chemistry. That's maturity. The empath stops falling in love with potential, stops trying to heal emotionally unavailable people, stops confusing emotional pain with emotional depth, and for the first time in their life, they begin feeling emotionally safe within themselves. That safety changes everything, because when you finally become emotionally safe for yourself, you stop tolerating environments that threaten your peace. The empath no longer fears loneliness. In fact, they begin preferring solitude over fake connection, because solitude heals. Fake connection destroys slowly. Read that in your soul. Fake connection destroys. Slowly. Some people drain your energy so subtly you don't realize how heavy they are until they leave your life. And when they leave, peace returns. Your anxiety decreases. Your sleep improves. Your mind becomes quieter. That's how the empath realizes peace was never boring. Peace was missing. For years, they confused emotional chaos with passion, thought emotional instability meant deep connection. But emotionally intelligent empaths eventually understand. Love should not feel like survival. That realization frees them emotionally. Now they stop forcing relationships that require self-betrayal, because no connection is worth losing yourself. No attachment is worth constant emotional suffering. And once the empath truly accepts this, their entire presence changes. They become calmer, harder to manipulate, harder to emotionally control. Because people can only control you through what you are afraid to lose. And the empath is no longer terrified of losing people. They are terrified of losing their peace. That shift creates unstoppable inner power. Now they walk away from disrespect immediately. Not because they are cold, because they finally understand self-respect is more important than attachment. And emotionally intelligent people know something most people never learn. Protecting your peace will cost you relationships. But every relationship that costs your peace is already too expensive. That truth changes lives. The empath begins letting go gracefully, not angrily, just clearly, because clarity creates detachment. The moment you clearly see someone's patterns, their manipulation loses power over you. And emotionally intelligent empaths become masters at recognizing patterns. They notice emotional inconsistency immediately. Notice hidden resentment, fake loyalty, conditional love, and instead of arguing about it endlessly, they quietly create distance. Because peace does not beg, peace leaves. That's why healed empaths become unrecognizable to people who once controlled them emotionally. The empath who once chased closure now chooses silence. The empath who once over-explained their pain now protects their vulnerability carefully. The empath who once tolerated emotional chaos now walks away the moment their spirit feels disturbed. And the most shocking part? They no longer feel guilty for it, because inner peace removes the need to constantly sacrifice yourself for acceptance. The empath finally realizes they spent years trying to become enough for people who were never emotionally available enough to appreciate them. And once they understand that, they stop shrinking themselves for connection, stop abandoning themselves for love, stop carrying emotional burdens that were never theirs to carry. Now they choose calmness, stillness, freedom, because real inner power